further ado, let's go into the session Symmetry with Marcus du Sautoy, introduced by Jim al-Khalili. Let's give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. Well, very well pronounced as well. Contrary to what you might think, I wasn't asked to introduce our next speaker because of our matching hairstyles, but rather because we're both British academic scientists. Well, a physicist and a mathematician, to be more correct. And in fact, I think Marcus is reciprocating by introducing me on Monday afternoon. What's lovely about literature festivals these days, and I think Jaipur is a wonderful example of that, is that science and talks about science, both at a very popular level and indeed in considerable depth sometimes, is now becoming part of popular culture. If you've been hearing talks earlier today, we've heard the usual stuff you might expect to hear in a literature festival. Talks about politics, economics, military history, how to write biographies, the art of writing non-fiction. And here we are now, a talk about symmetry. Marcus du Sautoy is a professor of the public understanding of science at Oxford. I've known him for many years. He's a prime example of a scientist, an academic scientist, who is bringing science and the arts together by the visual arts, music, and I think his talk this afternoon on symmetry is an example of how a concept which is very important in science, in mathematics, can cross over and be explained in a way to show its importance in nature, in art, in other walks of life. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Marcus du Sautoy.
Thank you, Jim. Get the On the 30th of May, 1832, a gunshot was heard ringing out across the 13th arrondissement in Paris. A peasant who was walking to market that morning ran towards where the gunshot was heard from, and on the ground he found a young man writhing in agony, clearly shot by a dueling wound. The young man's name was Évariste Galois, and he was a well-known revolutionary in Paris at the time. Now, Galois was taken to the local hospital, the Cochin Hospital, where he died in the arms of his brother Alfred. There we are. And he said to his brother Alfred, "Don't cry for me, Alfred. I need all the courage I can muster to die at the age of 20. Now, it's not quite clear what the duel was about that morning. Some believe it might be the establishment trying to get rid of this troublesome revolutionary. Others suggested it might have been a duel with a friend over a woman they both loved. Some have even suggested he staged his own death in order to try and spark a new revolution in Paris. But actually, it wasn't revolutionary politics for which the young Évariste Galois became famous. Because a few years earlier, while still at school, he had in fact solved one of the greatest unsolved problems in mathematics. And he tried to write to the academicians in Paris, trying to explain his great breakthrough. Unfortunately, the academicians couldn't understand a word of what he was writing, partly because this is how he wrote most of his mathematics. The night before that duel, he realized this could be his last chance in order to try and explain his great breakthroughs. So he stayed up all night writing away his mathematical ideas. And as the sun came up over the next day, he left these documents on his desk for his friend and went out to meet his destiny. Maybe the fact that he stayed up all night doing mathematics was the reason that he was such a bad shot that morning and got killed. But those documents that he left behind, many of us in mathematics regard as some of the most important documents in the whole of our subject. Because inside there, he found a new language to articulate one of the most fundamental concepts in the whole of science, namely the concept of symmetry. This language is called group theory, and actually as a practicing mathematician in Oxford, I study symmetry, and I use this language that Galois developed while still at school at the age of 18 every day in my practicing life. Now, I tried to tell the story of Galois. He's the main protagonist in my second book, Finding Moonshine, which is all about humans' attempts to understand this fundamental concept of symmetry. But I also tried to do something slightly more interesting than just a classic non-fiction science book. So through this book, I also wove a second narrative, which is a very personal story of what it is for me to be a mathematician. I think many people understand what people like Jim do. They smash atoms together in the Large Hadron Collider, or chemists, they mix chemicals together. But what is it a mathematician does every day in my office? So I thought I would keep a diary of 12 months in my working life throughout this book to try and give people this backstage pass to what it means to be a mathematician. So I decided I need to start it on a significant day. So a very significant day for a mathematician is their 40th birthday. Not because of some numerological significance of the number 40, but more because there's this terrible myth that we've done our best work by the age of 40, and after that it's downhill from there on. So I sort of wanted to prove to myself that actually, no, at my 40th year I'm still as productive and creative as ever, and I'm going to keep an account of it. And actually, my 40th birthday, I'm born in August. We were actually on holiday in Sinai, sitting on the sand, in 40 degrees heat, pretty much. But actually, when I was a child, unlike Galois, I hadn't wanted to be a mathematician at all. Actually, when I grew up, I'd wanted to be a spy. This had been partly fueled by my mother, who worked for the Foreign Office, and when she had children, she had to leave the Foreign Office. But she told me and my sister that she was allowed to keep the black gun that every member of the Foreign Office gets given. So I immediately assumed that my mother had been a spy. And she said this black gun was hidden somewhere in our house. So me and my sister used to spend all our childhood trying to find where this gun was. Of course, they taught her the art of concealment very well as well. So I decided if I'm going to get my own black gun, then maybe I have to join the Foreign Office and become a spy like my mother. So the Foreign Office sounded like, okay, foreign, you need to learn new languages. So when I went up to my secondary school, I took all the languages that my school did. We did French, German, we also did some Latin as well. Actually, the BBC were doing a course on Russian. So I got my French teacher to try and help me with the Russian course. You can tell, I thought that'd be terribly useful for a spy, you see, which shows how old I am because I grew up in the Cold War. But I began to get more and more frustrated with these languages because there are all these strange spellings of words you just had to learn. There's all these irregular verbs which didn't have any logic or sense to them at all. The Russian course was a complete disaster. I couldn't get past the word for hello, which has so many consonants and very few vowels, and it was even the name of the course, so I couldn't even say the name of the course. I don't know whether any Russian speakers here, but it's something like... I still can't do it. So I became very disillusioned with this dream of becoming a spy and learning all of these languages. And it was about that time, when I was about 12 or 13, that my maths teacher, in the middle of a lesson, said, "De Sautoy, I want to see you after the class." I thought, oh gosh, I'm in trouble. So I went up at the end of the class, and he took me around the back of the maths block, and I thought, whoa, I'm really in trouble now. But then he took out his break time cigar, and he explained he wasn't allowed to smoke in the common room with the other teachers. And he said, "De Sautoy, I think you should find out what mathematics is really about. Because it isn't really about all the long division, the percentages, the sines and cosines that we're doing in class. It's something much more exciting than that." And he actually recommended a few books to me that he thought would open up this world of mathematics for me. So I took this list of books home to my father, and we went up that weekend. I grew up in Oxfordshire. We went up to Oxford to try and find these books. If any of you have been to Oxford, you might have been to a bookshop called Blackwell's. We were told about this bookshop. I don't know whether you have Doctor Who here, but Blackwell's is a little bit like the TARDIS. It's this time machine which looks very small on the outside, but when you go in, it's huge on the inside. So this bookshop in Oxford is a little bit like that. It's very disappointing on the outside, but once you go in, it seems to be a treasure trove of books. And all down in the basement are all the science books. So we went down inside this Aladdin's cave of science books. And my father went to look for the books, and I sort of wandered around, pulling books off the shelf, looking inside, and it seemed to be all written in some sort of strange code. I couldn't understand a word of it. But there were undergraduates kind of leaning up against the shelves, reading these things as if they were novels. I mean, there seemed to be wonderful stories being told that they were absorbed in. So I was very intrigued by what these stories were. So we went home and I started reading these books. And one book in particular made a very big impression on me. It's a book called The Language of Mathematics. And I still have the copy of the book that we bought in Blackwell's when I was a 13-year-old. It cost £1.25. I don't think you can buy a book in Blackwell's these days costing that. But this book really surprised me. First of all, I hadn't really understood that mathematics was a language. But as I began to read this book, I realized what a powerful language it was. It's a language which can help you to look back into the past and see where we've come from. More excitingly, it was a language that can help you to look into the future and see what might be about to happen next. And this book was full of wonderful stories. What most appealed to me was this language. It didn't have any irregular verbs. Everything made perfect sense. It was all logical. But that's not to say it was boring. It was full of twists and turns and surprises. But it was appealing to my sense of a desire for a logic and structure. And the language that I fell in love with in this book was this language that Galois developed, a language which helps you to understand the visual world of symmetry and make it something that you can talk about. So I decided in this book to explore sort of what humans have done in trying to understand symmetry. And I began to realize that symmetry actually is in some sense nature's language. Nature uses symmetry to communicate information. So for example, if we're in the garden and you have a bumblebee flying around the garden, a bumblebee has very bad vision. Can't judge distances, the world of color is very confusing for it, but what it can pick out are shapes with symmetry, because it knows that that's likely to be a flower which will have sustenance and food inside it. And it's interesting that research has been done to show that the more symmetrical a flower, the sweeter the nectar inside the flower. The flower in its turn needs to have the bees come to it to propagate its genetic heritage. So the symmetry is a little bit like a language that they're communicating between each other. It's a billboard shouting out, "Come and visit me." But also humans, we also are attracted to symmetry. If I give you two, there we go. Here are two faces, but I've made them artificially symmetrical on the lower layer. If I ask most of you to choose which ones do you think are more beautiful, on average, most people go for the lower two, which are much more symmetrical than the slightly asymmetrical natural faces that we have. So why do we associate this sense of beauty in a face with symmetry? Again, this is symmetry communicating information. It's a language telling somebody. It's very difficult to make symmetry in the natural world. It very quickly breaks down and becomes asymmetrical. So if you can make a face which is symmetrical, that shows that you've got a very good genetic heritage and a good upbringing and will make a good mate to have children with. So the symmetry is actually communicating information about you as a potential mate. And that's what we seem to be responding to. And I rather like this quote of Galileo's, which I think really sums up the power of mathematics as a language to describe the world around us. He wrote, "The universe cannot be read until we have learnt the language and become familiar with the characters in which it is written. And it is written in mathematical language, and the letters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which means it is humanly impossible to comprehend a single word." So I was intrigued to look back and see in this book, well, what were the first attempts at humans to try and articulate this world of symmetry? And interestingly, if you go to the British Museum, so the month of September, the second chapter of the book, I took my son Tomer off and we investigated the British Museum in London to try and see what we could find. What were the earliest examples of symmetrical objects that humans created? And interestingly, Tomer, my son, he was 8 years old at the time. He's now a little bit older. I think he really resents me for freezing him as an 8-year-old in this book. But he's a very important character in this book because I used him a little bit like an innocent set of eyes throughout the book. I have now very, very sophisticated language that I see the world around me, and I was quite... I found my son a very useful sort of passepartout character on my journey through this world of symmetry to see what he thought symmetry was and what he saw. So we went off to the British Museum and we found this amazing game called the Game of Ur. And it dates back to 2600 BC. It's kind of an early forerunner of backgammon. And the dice they used are not the traditional dice we now use in backgammon, the cube-shaped dice, but little tetrahedrons. Now they used to use ankle bones or knuckle bones of sheep, but they're rather asymmetrical. And you need symmetry if you want a dice to be fair. So they started to carve these things and discovered this 4-pointed little pyramid. So I've got an example here. So it's a little triangular-based pyramid called a tetrahedron, and it has 4 triangular faces. And what they did was to colour 2 of the corners black, and you would toss a load of tetrahedrons and then count how many black spots are pointing up, and that would be your move in the Game of Ur. And this is an early forerunner of backgammon. So symmetry is very important for those playing games. Now, it's intriguing that at the same time in Scotland, there were in fact artists exploring symmetry. So if you go to the Ashmolean Museum in London, in Oxford, you find these amazing Neolithic stones which were discovered in Scotland. They date back to 2500 BC. And you can see the artist exploring the different possibilities of carving a stone with patches on the side. So they're a little bit like little footballs. And you can see the tetrahedron, the cube, but more complicated arrangements where each of the patches is symmetrically arranged. No one is different from any other. So they discovered 5 patches. And here's the artist first exploring the symmetry. And it takes really to the ancient Greeks before there's a more mathematical approach. And in fact, Euclid's Elements, probably the greatest textbook of all time, go on, change for me. There we go. Gives a proof that there isn't a 6th way to arrange those patches. So if you're creating a dice and you want all the faces to be symmetrical and arranged symmetrically, then there are only 5 different possibilities for the way to do this. And I think this is the power of mathematical language. The artist can create possibility, but it's really only with mathematical language that we can realize the limits of those possibilities and prove that there isn't a 6th way to put shapes together to make a symmetrical dice. Now, Plato thought that these symmetrical shapes were so important that he associated them with the building blocks of the universe. The building blocks at the time were earth, wind, fire, and water. And he believed each of these elements had their own different mathematical shape. So the tetrahedron that we've seen already was the spikiest of those. That was fire. The cube was, stable cube was earth. You can put together 8 equilateral triangles to make an octahedron, and that was associated with air. In fact, you can put 20 equilateral triangles together to make this beautiful shape called the Icosahedron, the most spherical of the shapes, and that he associated with water. And he had one shape left over, this beautiful shape, the Dodecahedron, made out of 12 pentagonal faces. And this he associated with the shape of the universe. The universe at the time, we believed it was encased in some sort of glass dome, and Plato believed that the shape of that would be a symmetrical shape, an important shape, the dodecahedron. Now, from our modern perspective, this looks a rather crazy classification. We no longer believe that elements are earth, wind, fire, and water. But actually, Plato had got to the heart of something very important in the scientific world, namely that symmetry is really underlying all of the sciences. So, for example, Jim's colleagues at the LHC, for example, a crystallographer, what crystals are possible is really a question about what symmetries are possible. A diamond gets its strength because it arranges the carbon atoms in the shape of the tetrahedron, and that's what gives it its strength. In biology, you actually don't want to get a symmetrical object because they're rather nasty. A lot of viruses assume symmetrical shapes, and they use the shape of a virus because it's a very efficient shape to make, and it has a lot of strength. So a virus has a very small amount of DNA, which is its program for recreating itself, and it needs to be able to communicate something very quickly, and so the shape of these viruses are very often symmetrical objects. So, for example, studying the AIDS virus, the HIV, it's very important to understand the underlying symmetry that's it's assuming so you can attack it. And Jim's colleagues at the LHC, they're actually using symmetry to understand the fundamental particles that make up the material world. And interestingly, we can make predictions about new particles because we realize these particles seem to be part of some very high-dimensional shape, and sometimes there are faces missing. And you can use that knowledge to make predictions about particles that you should be seeing which aren't there at the moment. So symmetry is a very important motivator for discovering what we might not have seen already. Now, symmetry is a very important subject for most sciences, but it's also an important subject, I think, for the arts. We see symmetry very much played with in the arts. But I think in the arts, there's a slightly more ambiguous relationship to symmetry. For example, maybe I have to get closer. There we go. Maybe I have to go down the stairs each time. So here's Thomas Mann talking about symmetry in the Magic Mountain. And for many artists, symmetry is a little bit too controlling. The character in the Magic Mountain is describing a snowflake. He said, I shuddered at its perfect precision, found it deathly, the very marrow of death. And I think for many artists, the sort of restrictions that symmetry put on you are something that they try and fight against a little bit. But I think there is one art form which does explore symmetry and enjoys reveling in symmetry, and that is music. And I think music and mathematics have a big relationship to each other. And you see musicians playing with symmetry as a way of making connections between themes and variations. And one of my favorite, probably, I have to go further. There we go. Bach is probably regarded by many as a mathematician's favorite composer. And if anyone knows the Goldberg Variations, actually when you were coming to sit down, I had one of the variations playing. And the Goldberg Variations is really an exercise in exploring symmetry. There's an aria which starts the variations, and then there are 30 variations, and then it finishes with the same aria. So you kind of get this sense of a circle where Bach joins the two ends up with this aria. And actually, the 16th variation, Bach calls an overture. Now, usually an overture is the beginning of a piece, so it's kind of not clear quite where the beginning of the Goldberg Variations is. There's this kind of circular structure. Now, every third variation is a canon. You've probably done these things at school where you sing, and then somebody comes in a little later, sings the same thing, and the two voices intermingling give this beautiful thing called a canon. Bach loved the idea of a canon, and every third variation is a canon. But to add a little bit of variety, each new variation of the canon, he gets the second voice to start a note higher. So gradually, the second voice, as you go to each new variation, gets higher and higher and higher until by the 8th variation, it hits the octave. And suddenly you hear the same note again. So again, you get this sense of another circle appearing within the canons. And even the different rhythms that he uses within those canons, Bach goes through all the different combinations, and just like a mathematician, that are possible. He breaks the canon up either into 2 beats, 3 beats, or 4 beats, and then each beat is either divided up into quavers, triplets, or semiquavers, and like two triangles, like a combination lock, he makes sure that each canon covers all of the different possibilities. And the variations themselves use a lot of reflectional symmetry or rotational or translational symmetry. So the Goldberg Variations is really, I believe, like a song to symmetry. And Bach's student, Mitzler, used to say that Bach's music was the process of sounding mathematics. Let me go down the hill. Now, this is one of the variations, so you can hear a little bit of the symmetry playing in the heart. actually, I would say it's the 20th century composers that have perhaps picked up the mantle of threading mathematics and the ideas of symmetry through their music. And one of my favorite is actually a Greek composer called Yannis Xenakis. This is one of the pieces he wrote called Metastasis. And you can see the score looks like a piece of geometry, really, rather than a piece of music. But it's a piece for solo cello that I'm going to play you. And he based this piece on a symmetrical object that exists in the three-dimensional world. And I want you to listen to this piece of music and see what symmetrical shape is conjured up by the following piece. So, did anyone get any symmetrical shapes appearing in their mind? Well, that was in fact a cube, but even I'm hard pushed to hear a cube when I listen to that piece of music. But actually what Xenakis did was to use different musical ideas that the cello could do. So you could hear the pizzicati, the glissandi. He has this idea that you can turn the bow over and slap the strings with the wooden side of the bow. And he put these on the corners of the cube. And then each different variation, he would do a symmetry of the cube, and that would control the next order that these different musical sounds that the cello can make. And he had another cube running which controlled how long would be spent on each of these things. And it was by putting these constraints on that he felt that he could then be creative and take himself somewhere new. In fact, Stravinsky used to say that it was only under huge constraints that he could be creative. And these mathematical constraints are often very appealing, I think, to a composer because they push them in a completely new direction. Now, it's interesting, as well as being a composer, Xenakis was also an architect. And I think architecture is again somewhere where you see the artist and the engineer coming together and putting a lot of different symmetrical objects. So, for example, if we go to the pyramids in Egypt, little symmetrical objects sitting there in the sand, right back to ancient time. But if you go to Paris, Paris is full of amazing symmetrical objects. So you find, if you go to La Villette, the science area, you find this extraordinary sphere sitting in there. Now, in fact, this was a realization of a dream of the revolutionaries in Paris, because they felt they wanted to build a sphere in Paris, because they felt the sphere represented the ideas of the revolution, égalité, no direction favored over any other. But a sphere is very difficult to make. It took 200 years later before they finally built this. Although I think the revolutionaries will be a little bit disappointed to learn that this is in fact an IMAX cinema, not a particularly revolutionary building. If you go to Israel, there are these amazing flats which are constructed in the shape of a dodecahedron in Ramot, but I'm told that these are terrible to buy furniture for. And actually, in the month of November, I went off to a conference in Japan on my area of research, and I met up with a colleague that I write with, Professor Kurokawa, and he learned that I was writing this book on symmetry, and he said, well, I have to take you up to the temples in Nikko, because the temples are full, and the Shinto shrines are full of lots of symmetrical designs. And we took this photo here, and then afterwards we walked up through the arch, and you can see the four pillars. I think there are 12 of them layered, and they've got this beautiful symmetrical design growing up them, except for one, which is upside down. The symmetrical design is going the wrong way. And I said to Professor Kurokawa, wow, the architect must have been so angry, the builders, that they put this one upside down. And he said, no, it was a very deliberate choice. They like to create a little bit of imperfection. And he referred me to this lovely book called the Japanese Essays in Idleness, which dates back to the 14th century, in which the essayist expresses, in everything, uniformity is undesirable. Leaving something incomplete makes it interesting and gives one the feeling that there is room for growth. Even when building the imperial palace, they always leave one place unfinished. And I think this is what artists love doing. They love using symmetry to set up expectations, which then they can break in interesting ways. And even if you go back to the Goldberg Variations, The 30th variation, you think you've heard so much symmetry and pattern building up that you think you know what's going to happen next. And then suddenly Bach does something completely different. It's called a quadlibet, a musical joke, and it's got nothing to do with the structure that's gone on before, except that it accentuates how much structure there has been, that somehow the pillar has been turned upside down. But I guess being somebody who explores the world of symmetry, if I had to be banished to one building in the world and had to choose one building, I would probably choose the Alhambra in Granada. The Alhambra in Granada is this beautiful palace in the south of Spain. If you've ever been there, you'll realize why this is just a palace kind of celebrating symmetry. And in the month of October, the 3rd chapter of the book, I took my family off to a trip there to explore the mathematics of the Alhambra. My family hates these kind of mathematical trips that I make them go on. Here's my 8-year-old son. You can see how much he is enjoying this mathematical trip to the Alhambra. But I was kind of intrigued to see how he would react to the symmetry that's all over the place in this palace compared to my sort of mathematical way of looking at the walls. Even the water there's so much water everywhere, throwing up reflections of the buildings, and there's sort of a symmetry already sort of there. But you realize how delicate symmetry is, because I remember after we took this photograph, 2 girls came up to try and grab a goldfish that was in the water, and suddenly the symmetry was shattered, the reflection had gone. But it's probably in the walls, that the tiles that cover the walls in the Alhambra where the real games of symmetry are being explored. And here's the artist just exploring what's possible with the world of symmetry on a 2-dimensional wall. And it was intriguing. With the entrance to the Alhambra, you find this very complex pattern. It's the middle one on the left-hand side. And I was intrigued to ask my son, do you think this is symmetrical? And his first reaction was no, he couldn't see any symmetry in there at all. It's quite a complex design. But what I think he was looking for, and what I think most people think of when you say symmetry, is that reflectional symmetry. The symmetry in the face, or the symmetry that's thrown up by the water or a mirror. So what is symmetry? Why do you feel that there's some symmetry hiding behind these walls? And how do you articulate that symmetry? How do you articulate whether the artist found all symmetrical possibilities that you can do on a wall? How can you say whether some of those walls have the same symmetry, although they might look very different? And this is what Galois did. He created a language which helps us to explore what symmetry is. So here's this wall. I like to call symmetry the magic trick moves. What can I do to these tiles and stop them such that when I stop them, they look like they did before I started to move them? So if I'd asked you to close your eyes and I'd moved all of these tiles and you open them and somehow the tiles don't look like they've moved, that is what Galois regarded as a symmetry. It's something that you can do to an object such that after you've done the move, it looks like it did before. So if I take something like a tetrahedron and I ask you to close your eyes, and then I move the tetrahedron and you open them, the tetrahedron looks like it did before you close your eyes, but actually I've made a move. And Galois believed that that was the essence of symmetry, that it's the moves that you make. Interestingly, in contrast to Thomas Mann, who thought that symmetry was something deathly, the very marrow of death, for a mathematician, symmetry is full of movement. It's full of life and energy. It's the things that you can do to the thing such that it looks like the same as it did before. And Galois realized that this was a very powerful language to be able to read the walls, for example, in the Alhambra. So I'm going to warn you a little bit. I'm going to push you a bit mathematically now, because I want to try and give you a little bit of a sense of the language that he created, so that when you go out and you start to see the symmetry all over the place here in Jaipur, to see whether you can use this language to understand what are the symmetries and how are they working. So just brace yourselves a little bit to be pushed into this new language, and if it pushes you too far, just please sit back and enjoy the ride. But I wanted to try and see if I can give you a sense of how Galois created this language to be able to read the world around us. So his idea is that it's these magic trick moves. So let's explore 2 shapes. I'm going to explore what are the symmetries of this 6-pointed star, which I put a little twist on, and the symmetries of the triangle. Now, symmetries are the magic trick moves. So what can I do to this 6-pointed star such that I can move it? So I can move it by 1/6 of a turn, put it back down again, and it looks like I did it did before I moved it. I'm going to use this little yellow dot to keep track of what we've done. So that's one move, a sixth of a turn. But there are other things you can do with this six-pointed star, hopefully. Yep, here we go. So I can turn it by a third of a turn, and that's a different move. So I've got two different symmetries. And I can do half a turn, or two-thirds of a turn. Seem to have to go further down every time I turn it a little bit more. There we go. Two-thirds of a turn, and 5/6 of a turn. So there are 5 different moves I can make. They're different genuine moves. So there are different symmetries, different moves that I make to that starfish. Now there is, in fact, a 6th symmetry. Galois regarded there to be a 6th symmetry. Can anyone see another thing that I can do to that which will make it look like it did before I moved it? There's lots of people going flip. Now, actually, no, because I put a little twist on it. So if you picked up this starfish, twisted it round, it would look different. You wouldn't be able to put it back down on its outline because I put the twist. So it's not a flip. Interestingly, well, 360-degree turn is a very interesting thing because actually that's the same as just leaving it where it was, isn't it? It's like picking it up and putting it down, but she's absolutely right. And it's very important, I think, that this is something that in India you would understand because this symmetry is a bit like the number 0. The number 0 counts absolutely nothing. Why on earth do you need a number to count nothing? But it was the Indians, Brahmagupta, who realized in the 7th century a great leap of... Okay, you're saying somebody else, but there you go. I learned something when I come here. But the idea that you have a number to count nothing turned out to be a revolutionary moment in mathematics. And for Galois as well, the idea of just picking this thing up and putting it back down again, you've got to regard that as like the 0th symmetry. So we all have symmetry, we just stay how we are. So this actually has 6 symmetries. But now let's turn to the triangle. What can you do to the triangle? Well, I can rotate it by a third of a turn clockwise, or a third of a turn anti-clockwise. There we go. But now I can do the flips that some of you are doing because this one hasn't got a twist. So I can actually flip the... I've got to go further down. There we go. One flip, which you keep x stable and you flip the z and the y. Or I can actually flip through the line through y. And there's a third flip I could do. I could flip through the line through z. Oops. There we go. So that's 5 symmetries, and then we have the 6th symmetry, which is just leaving the triangle where it is. So interestingly, these two objects have the same number of symmetries. They both have 6 symmetries. So perhaps we should say they have the same symmetry. But no, we feel there's something slightly different between these two objects. But how can we articulate that? And this is what Galois did. He realized that not only is these magic trick moves, but it's the way that you combine these moves together. If I do one magic trick move and then do another one, the combination is a third magic trick move. So actually there's a grammar hiding behind here, a grammar which relates the symmetries to each other. So let's do an example. So if I take, I'm going to give names to all of these symmetries. So if I keep the starfish where it is, I'm going to call that A. If the little yellow dot moves down to B, I'm going to call that capital B. So these are the names for the magic trick moves. And so this little table here keeps track of, if I do, so let's do a rotation of a 1/6 of a turn, that's the rotation B, but then I'm going to do a 1/3 of a turn, which is the rotation C. The combination of those, B followed by C, you look inside the grid, so you look at B in the first column, C in the first row, and you see that the combination of those, so if I do B, there we go, and then I follow it by a 1/3 of a turn, well, the combination is as if I just done half a turn in one go. So this shows that there's a kind of language and grammar which relates these symmetries. And the interesting thing is, if I did it in another order, what if I did C first, followed by D? I need to go down here. Well, if I do a 1/3 of a turn first, followed by a 1/6 of a turn, well, of course, it doesn't make any difference. It's still a half turn, so C followed by B is still D. But if you do this on the triangle, it's completely different. So the triangle, we're going to do a 1/3 of a turn and then a flip. So a 1/3 of a turn anti-clockwise, which we call U, and then we're going to flip in X, and that's the result. The combination of that is as if I just flipped inside Z. But if we reverse the order, the interesting thing is that it results in the triangle be left in a different position. So if I do the twist, this reflection first, then the rotation, actually that's as if I'd flipped in the Y. And actually you can explore this afterwards. If you're going to the bar, do you have bar mats here? You probably have bar mats, little square mats. If you take one of these squares and you look at the picture underneath, what I want you to do is to do a rotation by 90 degrees and then flip it and see where the picture is pointing. Then return it back to the same position, do the flip first and then the rotation, and you'll see the picture is pointing in the opposite direction. So the language here enables you to see, actually, the way that these symmetries combine, it actually matters what order, whilst for the starfish it didn't. So the language of how the symmetries interact with each other is a way of articulating why the triangle has different symmetries to the starfish. Not only that, Galois realized there are kind of rules for how these tables fill out. You're obsessed with Sudokus here in India? We are in England, and there's a kind of like little Sudoku rules, so you can't see the same symmetry occurring in a column or a row in these tables. And Galois realized these rules kind of restrict what symmetrical things are possible. So if you've got an object with 6 symmetries, then either those 6 symmetries behave like the triangle, or they behave like the starfish. And he realized that there are no other objects other than these 2 objects with 6 symmetries. They may look different, but they'll have the same symmetry, the way the symmetries work are the same. And this enables us to then go back to the Alhambra and explore why these 2 walls, which look very different, in Galois' language, he's able to articulate why these are geometric expressions of the same underlying symmetry. So you see this lovely shimmering sort of triangle, and then these rather weird sort of Zs and 6-pointed stars. So what are the symmetries? The symmetries are the magic trick moves. So we have to take one of these walls and see all the different ways that you can move the tiles. So here we go. So there's a place where you can fix the tiles and rotate by 1/6 of a turn, and suddenly they all match up on top of each other. So that's one symmetry. We're ignoring the colors here. But there's another point. You could fix the point in the middle of these shimmering triangles. So we fix that one and rotate in the center of the triangle. We'd have to go 1/3 of a turn for them to match up on each other. And then there's another interesting symmetry, and this one's quite hard to find. If you look at halfway along an edge, now we have to rotate by 180 degrees, half a turn, and suddenly they all match up on top of each other. So these are the magic trick moves hiding behind this particular wall, which is expressing its symmetries. But if we go to this completely different design, we find the same 3 symmetries at work. There's one where we fix a 6-pointed star in the center and rotate it. But there's also one, if we join the Z pieces where they join up, I can rotate by 1/3 of a turn around those. And then the interesting one is halfway between the 2 6-pointed stars. There you have to, there we go. Now you have to rotate by 180 degrees, and the 2 6-pointed stars sort of swap places with each other. So interestingly, although these walls look very different, Galois' language enables you to express the fact that their symmetries are actually the same. So it's a little bit like the concept of number. I have 4 people at the front here sitting on 4 chairs. Now the people are very different from the chairs, but the underlying abstract idea of the number 4 is common to both of them. So that's what Galois realized, that although the pictures might look very different, underlying them, you're able to articulate that there's something common to both of them, and they both have the same symmetries. So this symmetries we call 6-3-2 to denote the fact that there are different rotations. Here's another sort of symmetry. The entrance to the Alhambra, the floor in the Alhambra when you go into the first room, and the roof, the ceiling. These symmetries are called 4-4-2. Nothing to do with football, but because there are 2 places where you can do 1/4 of a turn, and another place half a turn. Although these pictures look very different, Galois' language suddenly enables you to say why actually they're examples of the same underlying symmetry. And with this language, you're able to then articulate, a bit like Euclid did with the dice, that what are the limits then? What are the number of different symmetrical games that you can play in the Alhambra? And it turns out, it was proved at the end of the 19th century, that there are in fact only 17 different symmetries that you can make on the walls in the Alhambra. There's no way to make an 18th design which isn't actually the same as one of these different 17 symmetries. And that was our kind of challenge for my family when we went to the Alhambra on this trip in October, was did they discover all 17 in the Alhambra? Did the artists in the 14th century, 13th century, who never had this language that Galois had available to him, did they, with their creative process, actually uncover all 17? And they almost did. The one they didn't quite get was this one in the bottom right-hand corner called star 333. If those blue tiles were in fact black, then in fact this would have been an example of the last 17th symmetry. I was deeply tempted to go and paint them in and make sure that they were black, but my family said we will disown you if you do that. So it's interesting that Galois language enables you to see not only what's possible, but also the limits of what's possible. And he also understood something extraordinary, which is that symmetry, a little bit like the molecular world, has atoms, symmetrical objects, which are kind of the building blocks of all symmetrical objects. So in something like chemistry, it's a very important, the periodic table is extremely important tool for a chemist. It lists all the things from which you can make molecules. Hydrogen and oxygen goes to make up water, sodium and chlorine makes salt. Galois realized that for mathematics as well, with symmetry, we can create our own periodic table. Now this periodic table, it took until the 1980s for us to complete it. 150 years from Galois' discovery that it's possible to have these basic atomic symmetries. And in fact, it's something we call the Atlas of Finite Simple Groups. It's a huge book. I decided that I would bring it to show it to you. And interestingly, inside this book, there are absolutely no pictures of any symmetrical objects. It's all in this mathematical language that Galois developed of algebra, which takes the pictures away and creates something, a different language to be able to articulate what these symmetries are. One of the interesting atoms of symmetry is actually the symmetry of a football. If you take a football made out of pentagons and hexagons, the symmetry of this object is actually one of the first interesting atoms inside this kind of periodic table of symmetry. Now, the first author here is John Conway. He's an expert in symmetry, and he was working at Cambridge at the time that I finished my undergraduate degree in Oxford. And I decided I would go up to talk to him to see whether I could join his group to understand the world of symmetry, because I wanted to carry on my journey having learned all about Galois' language. Here's a picture of John Conway. He's quite a sort of mad guy. His office is full of symmetrical objects. They just published this book. It was a very exciting moment. I went up to Cambridge, and he picked up this book and slammed it down on the table and said, "What's your name?" I thought, oh gosh, this interrogation. He said, so I said, "Marcus de Sautoy." He said, "We're rather obsessed with symmetry here in Cambridge." He said, "Marcus de Sautoy, that's you got a problem there. If you look at the authors in the Atlas, interestingly, all of the authors have 6 letters in their surname. It was Conway, Curtis, Norton, Parker, and Wilson. So he said, well, if you drop your do, we'll let you in. Sautoy, S-A-U-T-O-Y, that's fine. I said, well, I've got to give up my French aristocracy. I thought, oh, well, no, but I do love symmetry. So I thought, okay, we'll be prepared to do that. So, yeah, but what are your initials? I said, MPF. Marcus Peter Francis. I said, no, you're going to have to drop one of those too. I said, why? Why? So he said, we only have 2 initials in our name. It was G.H. Conway, R.T. Curtis, S.P. Norton. Okay, well, I'll have to drop one of those, the F or something. So M.P. Sautoy. I thought, okay, well, I do want to join their group. So they said, it's not only that. John Conway was the first person to come up with this idea of creating this kind of, what we call this atlas of symmetry. His PhD student was Rob Curtis. There was this kind of strange guy called Simon Norton who kept on hanging around the office, and eventually they let him join because he seemed to understand these things very nicely. And then they had another student who was very good at computing who joined the group. He was 4th to join, Parker. Then finally Wilson joined. They all joined in alphabetical order. So he said, you know, if you change your name to MP Sautoy with a Z, we'll let you in. And I thought, there's only certain places I'm prepared to go. So actually, I decided to go back to Oxford, and I spent, so I did my PhD in Oxford. And I was a little bit worried at the time, because, you know, maybe symmetry was finished. You know, here was the periodic table of symmetry. We knew all the building blocks. Perhaps that's the end of the game. Perhaps I'd arrived just a little bit too late. But what's exciting about mathematics, and I think is what makes it a living, breathing subject, is all of the unfinished bits of mathematics. It's all the things that we don't understand. And what we don't understand, although we know the building blocks, we don't know how to put them together to create new symmetries. So that's actually what I spend my time doing as a research mathematician, what I try to articulate in this book, the discovery of some new ways to put these together to create new symmetrical objects which nobody has ever seen before. And that's one of the exciting things about being a mathematician, to discover something genuinely new, something which will last forever. These kind of things give you a little sense of immortality, because species will die, stars will go out, but mathematics lives forever. It's got a certain sort of quality to it. So these new symmetrical objects that I discovered during the course of the year, proving that I wasn't finished as a mathematician at the age of 40, were very reassuring to me. And I came to the end of the book, the last chapter, and it was very interesting. I came back to that, so the last chapter of the book, I came back to that quote, actually, which has always resonated for me, that Professor Kurokawa told me in Japan. The idea that leaving something incomplete makes it interesting and gives them the feeling that there is room for growth. And in mathematics, it's actually, the theorems that I proved are wonderful, but actually coming to the end of that 40th year, it was all the problems I still hadn't solved. Those are the ones that gave my subject life and energy and made me realize, well, I'm going to carry on doing mathematics until the day I die, because I really want to know the answers to these unsolved problems. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Okay, well, lots of food for thought there. We have another session starting, I think, on the hour. So we have about 10 minutes, well, probably about 8 minutes for questions and answers. We have 3 roving mics, the front, the middle, and the back. So if maybe we can have a question from each section, if you raise your hands, and if I can probably see. Okay, so there's a young lady at the front. Anyone in the middle, please? Oh, yes. Okay, someone there, yeah. And anyone at the back on the other side? Gentleman there on the side, we won't go all the way to the back. Okay, yes, first question.
There we go.
I want to ask you, what do you think of ambigrams? Like the Illuminati ambigram, where if you invert the word, it still looks the same, which is mentioned in Dan Brown's book, Angels and Demons. Yeah.
I think it's a very good example of our obsession with symmetry, that we immediately are attracted to a word like that with that kind of game in. I think that our brains are almost programmed to try and read symmetry wherever we can, because just like the bee, when we see symmetry, that's something which is kind of important and it has a meaning inside it. The symmetry is got structure, and I think ever since we were in the jungle, the jungle is a chaotic mess of leaves and everything like that. But if you suddenly saw something with symmetry, well, that's likely to be an animal, which is either going to eat you or you could eat it, and so you take notice of it. So I think that's why we get quite obsessed. We start to push it. The number of times I'm phoned up by journalists on kind of special numerical days, the 5th of the 5th, 05 or something, and they want me to comment on this. I mean, there are so many days like this, but we're sort of programmed to notice them. And I think it's kind of an evolutionary aspect of us that, well, there might be meaning inside that. Not all of them are significant, but actually it's interesting because there's these kind of palindromes where things make sense backwards and forwards. There's a little story in the book. It's how I managed to get a flat in Israel, in Jerusalem, when I was a postdoc. I'm not Jewish, and nobody wanted to share a flat with this non-Jew arriving. But then this woman asked me, she said, "Do you know what a palindrome is?" And I said, "Yeah, it's one of those words." Good, the last flatmate didn't know what a palindrome is. So if you're not Jewish, the next best thing is to be an intellectual in Israel. So I got the flat. So.
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello. There are stuff in mathematics that are not symmetrical, but if you look at it in some other way, you find that there's some symmetry behind it. Like, I saw your book, I don't know, that small red colored book. You have a graph on that. I don't remember what it's called.
Probably the Fibonacci.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And our minds at times are interested in stuff that is not symmetrical. The attractors and chaos, they are not symmetrical but turn out to be something like that. And so I wanted to ask you, the myths that you read about and does it touch the asymmetrical side as well? So,
Absolutely. I think this is one of the interesting things. Actually, with those spirals and things like fractals, there is a symmetry hiding in there, but it's the language of Galois enables you to see symmetry which isn't just kind of physical. This is a symmetry of change of scale. A logarithmic spiral is interesting because if you zoom in on it, it looks the same as it did when you zoomed out. So that's a kind of move, but it's now just a magnification move. So this language enables you to start to see symmetries where you think, well, there is no symmetry there at all. But of course, symmetry and the breaking of it is very important, especially in Jim's world of physics. To understand why we get the complexity of the world around us is essentially the movement from high symmetry at the beginning of the universe to the cooling of it, and we start to see these breaks. It's a little bit like the artist breaking symmetry to make things slightly more interesting. But even so, something with a sphere is kind of got the three-dimensional object with most symmetry, but you can put dice inside there. They've got less symmetry, but still the symmetry is interesting and important. In the Alhambra as well, you're going from just a very plain square to putting a design in it, and then suddenly more interesting symmetries can come out even when you break them. But symmetry is I think one of the most stunning things for me is why are we symmetrical on the outside, yet our heart is on the left-hand side of our body? That's one of the extraordinary mysteries, I think.
Okay, time for one last question. We had a gentleman over standing up on the edge. Is there a microphone there?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, my question is rather very different. Do you believe in numerology, or what are your comments on numerology?
Actually, you might expect me to say, as a mathematician, numerology is a load of bunk. But actually, I'm not going to. I'm not going to, because I think at its heart, the search for meaning inside numbers is actually what drives me as a mathematician. So, yeah, sure, what is very important in being a scientist and a mathematician is, I think you've also almost got to have a split personality. You've got to have one personality which tries to find structure and meaning and patterns absolutely everywhere. And you have to be open to the possibility of mad things. That's when exciting things happen. When you sort of make a breakthrough where nobody else thought there was one, is often seeing something nobody else has seen. But then you have to apply your very critical side, and that's what often gets missed by numerologists. Okay, is this really significant, or is this just some sort of random, meaningless kind of noise which looks like it's got structure? So I think Kepler is a fantastic example of this. Kepler is a wonderful scientist, discovered lots of things about how the planets move, but one of his most crazy ideas was the reason that we had the planets that we could see in the night sky at that point, he believed was because the way you put those platonic solids I showed you together was the reason the planets were laid out like that, and each gap between the platonic solids corresponded to one of the planets. And that was kind of totally blown out of the water once we discovered Uranus, a new planet which didn't fit his idea. So you might say that's total nonsense, yet I still admire the spirit of the numerologist, which is to try and look for meaning and structure in the chaotic, messy world around us. But it needs to be combined with a very critical facility, which is what I think makes a scientist rather than a numerologist.
Okay, I'm afraid we do have to leave it there because there's another session starting. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Marcus de Sautoy again.
Thank you.
And let's give a round of applause to Jim al-Khalili as well for facilitating. Thank you. And thank you for such a dynamic session.
Well, thank you, audience, as well.